Steve Harvey stopped mid-joke. The studio froze. The audience held their breath. Because standing on that stage was a grandmother about to say her last words. The cameras were rolling. The lights were bright. But something in the air had changed. Steve Harvey, the man who'd made millions laugh for 3 decades, wasn't smiling anymore. His hand gripped the microphone tighter. His eyes locked onto the elderly woman standing just a few feet away from him. And in that moment, everyone in the studio knew this wasn't going to be just another episode of Family Feud. It started like any other taping. The Johnson family had won their preliminary round. Confetti still hung in the air. The scoreboard flashed their winning numbers. But when Steve turned to shake hands with the family matriarch, 78-year-old Margaret Johnson, something stopped him cold. Her hand was trembling. Not from nervousness. Not from excitement. It was the kind of tremor that comes from a body that's fought too long, too hard, and knows its time is running short. "You all right, sweetheart?" Steve asked, his signature humor softening into genuine concern. Margaret looked up at him with eyes that had seen 8 decades of life, and whispered just loud enough for the microphone to catch. "Mr. Harvey, I need to tell you something. This is my last goodbye." The entire studio went silent. Producers froze behind their monitors. Camera operators stopped adjusting their lenses. Because everyone suddenly understood, they weren't just witnessing television. They were witnessing a moment that transcended entertainment. Margaret had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. She'd been given 3 months. That was 4 months ago. Her family had applied to be on Family Feud as her dying wish, not for the money, not for the fame, but because for 50 years she'd watched this show. Through raising 6 children. Through losing her husband to Vietnam. Through chemotherapy sessions and sleepless nights. Family Feud had been her constant companion, her source of joy, her reminder that laughter still existed even when the world felt impossibly heavy. And now, standing on that stage she'd watched through a television screen for half a century, Margaret Johnson had something she needed to say. Steve Harvey did something he'd never done in 30 years of hosting. He stopped the show. Not for a commercial break. Not for a technical issue. He stopped it because some moments are bigger than production schedules, bigger than ratings, bigger than the business of entertainment. "Cut the cameras," he said softly. Then louder, to the control room. "I said cut the cameras." The red lights blinked off. The audience murmured in confusion. Producers started to protest through his earpiece, but Steve pulled it out and handed it to a stagehand. He walked over to Margaret, took both her hands in his, and said, "You take all the time you need, baby. This stage is yours." What happened next would become the moment that defined not just an episode, but Steve Harvey's entire legacy. Margaret began to speak. Her voice was weak, but steady. She talked about her granddaughter, sitting in the audience, who'd just been accepted to medical school. She talked about her son, standing at the podium, who'd beaten addiction and been sober for 5 years. She talked about her great-grandson, barely 2 years old, who she'd never see grow up. And then she looked directly at Steve and said, "Mr. Harvey, I want to thank you. Not just for today, but for every day. Because when my husband died, and I didn't know how I'd go on, your show reminded me that joy still exists. When I was going through chemo, and the pain was unbearable, your laugh made me forget, even for just 22 minutes. You've been in my living room for 50 years. And I needed to look you in the eye and tell you, you matter. What you do matters. You've made my life bearable when it felt unbearable." Steve Harvey broke. Not the performative emotion of a television host. The real, raw breakdown of a man who suddenly understood the weight of his own impact. Tears streamed down his face. He pulled Margaret into an embrace, and the entire studio, crew and audience alike, began to weep. There wasn't a dry eye in that building. Hardened cameramen who'd filmed thousands of episodes were crying behind their equipment. Producers who'd seen everything were sobbing in the control room. But Steve wasn't done. Because behind the scenes, he made a decision that defied every producer's expectation, every network protocol, every rule of television production. He turned to the audience, his voice thick with emotion, and said, "I want everyone in this room to understand something. We chase success. We chase money. We chase fame. But this, right here, this is why we do what we do. Not for ratings. Not for awards. But because somewhere out there, someone's life is a little bit lighter because we showed up and did our job with love." Then Steve did something that would make headlines for weeks. He took off his jacket, the designer suit jacket he'd worn on every episode, and draped it over Margaret's shoulders. "You keep this," he said. "And whenever your family needs to remember that you were here, that you mattered, that you made a difference, they look at this jacket and they know, Margaret Johnson stood on this stage and changed a man's life." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. But it wasn't just any card. On the back, he wrote in real time, "For Margaret's family. Anything you need. Anytime." "Steve!" The audience erupted. Not in applause for entertainment, but in a kind of ovation reserved for moments that remind us what it means to be human. The opposing family, who lost the game, walked across the stage and embraced Margaret. Strangers became family in that instant. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Production resumed, but the episode that aired wasn't the one that was planned. The network made the unprecedented decision to broadcast the moment in full. Unedited. Uncensored. Raw. The response was seismic. The episode became the most watched Family Feud in history. But more importantly, it became a movement. Viewers started sharing stories of their own Margarets, their own battles with terminal illness, their own moments of finding joy in the darkness. The hashtag Margaret's jacket trended worldwide. But here's what cameras didn't catch, what happened after the taping ended. Steve Harvey sat in his dressing room for 2 hours. He refused to leave. His team grew worried, knocked on the door, asked if he was all right. When he finally emerged, his eyes were red, but his face was set with determination. "Find out what hospital she's at," he told his assistant. "And clear my schedule. I'm visiting her every week until..." He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. For the next 6 weeks, Steve Harvey visited Margaret Johnson every single week. Not for publicity. Not for cameras. The visits were private, sacred. He'd sit by her bedside, tell her jokes, hold her hand when the pain got too much, pray with her when words failed. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. 3 weeks after the episode aired, Margaret passed away. Peacefully. Surrounded by family. And wearing Steve's jacket. At her funeral, over 1,000 people showed up. The church couldn't hold them all. People spilled into the streets. And Steve Harvey was there. He delivered the eulogy. "Margaret taught me something I'd forgotten," he said, his voice breaking. "She taught me that we're not just entertainers. We're companions. We sit in people's living rooms during their darkest hours. We have a responsibility to show up with love, with joy, with the reminder that life is still worth living. Margaret trusted me with her last goodbye. And I'll carry that trust until my own last day." The jacket became a symbol. Margaret's family framed it and donated it to the Smithsonian's Museum of American History, where it sits today with a plaque that reads, "The jacket that reminded us why we tell stories. The jacket that reminded us why we show up. The jacket that reminded us what it means to be human." After Margaret's death, Steve Harvey changed. Those who worked with him noticed it immediately. He was more present. More intentional. He started a foundation in Margaret's name to help families dealing with terminal illness. Every episode of Family Feud he filmed after that day, he wore a small pin on his lapel, a pin that Margaret's granddaughter had given him at the funeral. The pin simply said, "Show up with love." Years later, in an interview, Steve was asked about the moment that defined his career. Not his first TV deal. Not his stadium tours. Not his best-selling books. The Margaret moment. I've made people laugh for decades, he said. But Margaret made me understand why laughter matters. She didn't just watch a game show. She held on to hope through a screen. And when she stood on that stage and told me I mattered, she gave me something I didn't know I needed: purpose beyond the punchline. The episode won every major television award that year. But Steve didn't attend a single ceremony. Instead, he spent those nights visiting hospitals, sitting with terminal patients, listening to their stories, reminding them that their lives mattered. Margaret's granddaughter did become a doctor. She specializes in palliative care. And in her office, hanging on the wall behind her desk, is a photo of her grandmother, wearing Steve's jacket, smiling on the Family Feud stage. My grandmother's last wish wasn't just to be on the show, she said in an interview. It was to remind one man that his work mattered. And in doing so, she reminded all of us that our lives, no matter how short, no matter how painful, can leave an imprint that outlasts our final breath. The jacket still hangs in the Smithsonian. Thousands visit it every year. They stand in front of the glass case, reading the plaque, many of them crying. Because they see themselves in Margaret. They see their own battles, their own pain, their own desperate search for moments of light in the overwhelming darkness. And they remember that sometimes, the greatest act of love is simply showing up. Steve Harvey never forgot that lesson. In every interview since that day, he talks about Margaret. Not as a sad story, but as the moment that taught him what legacy really means. We think legacy is about what we build, he said. Buildings with our names on them. Awards on our shelves. Money in our accounts. But real legacy is about the moments we choose to stop everything and see another human being. Margaret gave me her last goodbye. And I gave her my jacket. But really, we gave each other something far more valuable, the reminder that we're here for each other. That's the only thing that matters in the end. The producers of Family Feud wanted to move on after that episode. Schedule the next families. Keep the machine running. But Steve refused. He insisted they air a follow-up segment about Margaret's life. They dedicated an entire episode to her story, featuring her family, her friends, and the lives she touched. That episode became the second most watched in the show's history. Margaret's impact didn't end with her death. Her story inspired a movement. People started sharing their own last goodbyes, their own moments of finding joy in impossible circumstances. The phrase, Margaret's jacket, became shorthand for the kind of compassion that costs us nothing but means everything. Steve Harvey continued to visit hospitals every week. He never publicized it. No cameras. No press releases. Just a man who'd learned that real power isn't in the spotlight, but in the quiet moments when nobody's watching. Years later, Margaret's great-grandson, the one she never got to see grow up, wrote Steve a letter. He was 10 years old. Dear Mr. Harvey, it read. My mom shows me the video of you and my great-grandma every year on her birthday. I never got to meet her, but I feel like I know her because of you. Thank you for loving her when she needed it most. When I grow up, I want to be like you. Not famous. Not rich. Just someone who shows up. Steve framed that letter. It hangs in his office, next to a photo of him and Margaret on that stage, his jacket draped over her shoulders, both of them crying, both of them smiling. Because in the end, that's what life is about. Not the big moments. Not the accolades. But the choice to stop, to see, to love when love is needed most. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The legacy of Margaret Johnson and Steve Harvey's jacket is still being written. Every time someone chooses compassion over convenience. Every time someone stops their busy life to truly see another person. Every time someone shows up with love instead of just showing up. That's the jacket's real power. Not the fabric. Not the designer label. But what it represents. The moment one man chose to break every rule because a human being's pain mattered more than a production schedule. And that choice changed everything. Steve Harvey still hosts Family Feud. He still makes millions laugh. But now, Every time he steps onto that stage, he carries Margaret with him. Her lesson. Her love. Her reminder that we're all here for such a short time, and the only thing that matters is how we choose to spend it. The Johnson family still watches Family Feud. Every episode. It's a tradition now. Margaret's great-grandson, her granddaughter who became a doctor, her son who stayed sober, they all gather, just like Margaret used to, and they watch. And sometimes, when Steve makes a joke that's particularly funny, they swear they can hear her laugh. Not on the television, but in the room with them. Still present. Still finding joy. Still reminding them that life, no matter how hard, is still worth showing up for. That's the real story of Margaret's jacket. Not a sad ending, but a beginning. The beginning of understanding that showing up with love is the only thing that ever really mattered. And somewhere, Margaret is smiling. Because her last goodbye became everyone's reminder to live.